Hi everyone, and welcome to the final session of Virtually 2022, Nomensa's free virtual web accessibility and digital inclusion conference. For our final session, we have for you a panel on what it means to be an accessible organisation, hosted by Nomensa's co-founder and director of accessibility, Alastair Campbell. So back at Interact Virtual Festival in 2020, we hosted a panel called Accessibility from the Trenches to the Boardroom, which with Alastair here, with Richard Morton and Leonie Watson. And we felt that kind of 2 years on, it's kind of really important to kind of revisit that subject. So joining us on our panel today, we have Pavel Pomerantsev of Squarespace, Satjinder Jabanda-Wilson of Virgin Media O2, Tzveta Dinova of ASOS, and Beverley from the Ministry of Justice. They're going to be discussing what makes an organisation accessible, why it matters, how to get buy-in from senior stakeholders, and discussing different challenges and success stories of how to embed a culture of accessibility within an organisation. My clear text are providing live captions, which you can either access through Zoom, or alternatively, I will drop a stream text link for you in the chat. This session is, of course, recorded and will be available online shortly after the conference with all of our other sessions from the week. So please do bear with us whilst we get those uploaded, and you will be the first to know when they are. As always, do get involved in the chat. Please say hello and join in the discussion. Just make sure your chat settings are switched to panelists and attendees, and that way everyone can see your messages. Also, if you've got any questions, please submit them using the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. So yeah, without further ado, I'll hand over to Alastair to kick things off.
Thanks, Henry. So I thought we'd start off with just setting a little bit of context, and we'll just go around and ask people to sort of introduce themselves and their sort of accessibility context at their organisation. So I'm going to go around clockwise from the view I have. Pavel, would you start?
Hi, everyone. I'm Pavel. I am the accessibility team lead here at Squarespace. And I've been in this role for about a year and a half. Before that, I was doing a little bit of accessibility kind of on the side at Squarespace. I was on a product team. And now the team has 2 engineers who act more like subject matter experts. We have 2 part-time people, a product manager and a content strategist. And we also have a halo of allies who are invested in the accessibility team doings in various ways, in various capacities. And that is kind of it.
Excellent. So that sounds like a sort of startup to kind of big tech, somewhere around those kind of that sort of organization. Tzveta, how about you?
Hi, I'm Tzveta, and I'm currently accessibility specialist at ASOS.com. I have been working in accessibility for about 5 years now, previously as a consultant, and I am currently in a team of 1, which is myself. I sit within product design and kind of more broadly within the ASOS kind of tech department. So I sort of work with a team of about 200 kind of engineers, product owners, designers who are taking care of our kind of customer facing platforms.
Okay, so 200 to 1. Got it. Beverley, how about you?
So yeah, I'm Beverley. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm the digital accessibility lead at the Ministry of Justice. We sit in the digital and technology team, which is around 2,000 or 3,000 people, I think. But the Ministry of Justice as a whole is about 80,000 people, so it's pretty broad. My team is 3 people large at the moment: myself, a mid-level specialist, and a delivery manager.
Right. Sat, how about you?
Hi there. Yeah, so I'm responsible for ensuring that our products and services are accessible but also inclusive by design, but also kind of from the doing the right thing point of view, but also from a policy and customer fairness perspective. So there's a lot of kind of regulatory requirements that I would get involved in as well. I work kind of on my own, but I also sit in the team where policy and customer fairness is key and important. I've kind of worked on accessibility now and supporting our disabled and vulnerable customers probably about 5 years. I've been in the business for 11, but it's always been a passion of mine to kind of explore doing more for our customers in that space. So I do kind of link in with a lot, or build relationships with a lot of stakeholders around the business. We're lucky enough to have senior stakeholder kind of buy-in, but there's also a lot of people that still don't know what we mean when we say accessibility or supporting disabled people. And yeah, it's kind of the educational piece, but also work with a lot of champions. I've built a network of champions that I link in with from a customer perspective, but also then taking those pain points and turning them into opportunities to make their experiences a lot better.
Right, thank you. And just to introduce myself, obviously I've been working in accessibility for a long time, for the history of Nomensa, and doing similar kind of roles to the other panelists, but from a kind of an external point of view. So I've worked with NHS, Department of Work and Pensions, and quite a few commercial organisations as well, doing quite similar things. So given all this experience we have in the panel, I thought it'd be good to ask what surprised the panelists most since you started, because everyone has their impressions sort of going into accessibility or building in or working into an accessibility role like Pavel did. But I was just wondering if anything, what didn't align in your experience from what you might have thought to start with. I'll start with Beverley, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and one that I spent quite a lot of time thinking about, actually. Because yeah, what was it that I found the most surprising? And I think for me, it's going to sound a bit silly, but how much easier it was to do this with a team. So I used to be a front-end developer, and I would be on my own making code fixes to the sites that I worked on 4 or 5 years ago. And it's actually just so much easier when you've got a team to discuss things with, when you're looking at accessibility on a much broader level. Because on the one perspective of accessibility is it's just making changes to code. But when you're looking at it in a more strategic way, there's so many different skills that are involved, such as writing documents, writing comms, running events, speaking to stakeholders, doing lots of different things like that, which require a lot more thinking in a very different way. And it's been so much easier with a team of people around me who are full-time to talk through, what do you think to this piece of writing, or what do you think to this approach? And yeah, I don't know why it surprised me so much, but that was probably the biggest thing that I've learned in these past couple of years.
Yeah, interesting. So it's essentially it's too wide a skill set for one person, really, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a lot of things we do.
Tzveta, how about you?
I think I can totally relate to what Beverley was just talking about. Unfortunately, I don't really know the feeling of having more people on my team, but I think I'm very lucky in the sense that we have some brilliant accessibility champions at ASOS who, have been incredibly helpful since day one for me, who have been kind of laying on the foundations way before I started as well. And I have been relying on them a lot. So in many ways, I think that's another way to do things. If you don't have a team, build a good accessibility champions network. But going back to the question, I think one of the things that surprised me probably when I first started in accessibility was how little awareness we have as a society around disabilities, and things like I had no context around how someone, for example, who's blind goes about their day, how they navigate the environment around them, how they use technology. And at the time, I think I probably thought that was just me and I had somehow missed all of this information, but it turns out that it's, we have pretty poor awareness unless you know someone who has a disability. And even then, I think you're very likely to just have one perspective rather than kind of a broader perspective. So this has been one of the things that I have personally focused on quite a bit, just giving my team members context around why we're doing this, the needs of the people that, are in our customer base, but we don't necessarily think about them, which is obviously wrong. So now we're kind of just trying to start from the beginning and just look at that basically as a whole, like who are these people and what are we trying to achieve? How are we trying to help them? And I guess the other thing is how creative the problem solving around accessibility could be. I think, again, when I started, a lot of the projects, particularly in the beginning, seemed very kind of focused on WCAG and focused on, you know, these are the guidelines and it's literally like a checklist. You're going through things, you're ticking things off. But actually, I think when you do the foundational work, so when you do a lot of the kind of WCAG related work, you realize that there's a lot of creativity that comes with accessibility, a lot of things that are not necessarily part of WCAG, and a lot of things that, you know, might be unique to your business needs and to your kind of customer needs. And this is where things actually get really exciting and really interesting, because you feel like you're being creative in the way that you're solving these problems.
Yeah, that resonates with me, that I got into accessibility in the first place because I found it so fascinating how you could have one interface that you're sort of giving to people via a website, but then so many different perspectives on how, or so many different ways that people actually used it. It was really interesting. Sat, how about you? What surprised you on this journey?
I think the amount of people that were so willing to make change. So I think when you kind of talk through that experience of somebody that doesn't interact with, you know, our website or our apps, or, you know, with our customer services in the same way as your standard person, a non-disabled person, it's a real eye-opener. And to give kind of those experiences and, you know, take them through that journey, it kind of flicks on a switch for a lot of people, but it also makes them go, well, I really want to do more. How can I help? So that's been the positive side. Flip side, you always get the odd person, which is great. It's just the odd person out of a massive organization that just says, that's not my problem. But again, it's well, how can I, you know, change that response, and how can I help you kind of understand that actually it is everybody's responsibility. Everybody should take a little bit of responsibility for, you know, whatever they're doing, whether it's, you know, designing a customer journey, or designing and developing an app and testing it and all of that stuff, the digital side, but also the non-digital side. I think everybody needs to, you know, take a little bit of what they do and not think about it as a, well, how does this work for, well, I think a lot of the time people think, well, how is this going to work for our customers? But they don't look at the, you know, the characteristics of our customers. You know, there's a lot of people that are disabled that have access needs. There's a lot of people that are neurodiverse that have other needs as well. So how do we cater for all of those? And it's about bringing, I guess, different people's perspectives into that conversation when you're designing something, and it not being a decision that one person or that those usual stakeholders take alone. So yeah, it's been insightful, but it's also kind of really rewarding that you get that sort of response to say, yes, I want to do more. How can I help you? And then you come to that, what Tzveta was saying about bringing those ideas to the table and actually really, you know, coming up with something that nobody has thought about. And that's before you even go out to external parties, you know, the experts, if you like, because I'm the subject matter expert, but I'm not the expert. I'm not disabled. I might be neurodiverse, but, you know, there's lots of other considerations that we need to make in that one product or service that we're putting out to our people.
Yeah, thank you. And Pavel, how about you?
So I came to accessibility through web development. I considered myself a regular web developer a few years back, and I knew next to nothing about accessibility. And I thought, like a lot of, especially web developers, I think that it's about sprinkling your HTML with a few ARIA attributes, but I didn't know what those were about. And so then I read a book by Hayden Pickering called Inclusive Design Patterns, and that completely converted me, because it's so much aligned with how I saw web usability and web development practices, all the progressive enhancement stuff. Oh yeah, another book is by Aron Gustafsson, in adaptive web design, I think. So those types of books really align with how I saw things, and I realized that it's not that hard to make some adjustments to your code or your design thinking to make your interface so much more accessible. So things like alt text for images, or aligning labels with form inputs properly. So that kind of stuff. So it all sounds simple. It all makes interfaces better for everybody. And what surprised me, to your question, is that it turned out to be hard to convince a lot of other people that this is the way. So it really takes much more than saying like, look, keyboard users have a hard time navigating your product, or users may not feel well looking at your large animation that they can't stop. And that kind of thing is really surprising, that for a lot of people it's kind of challenging their practices, and so I guess it's hard for them to take it into heart and be like, yeah, sure, we will do things differently from now on. So it takes a lot more than that to change the culture, especially if the organization is big like Squarespace. Yeah, and I didn't tell, but I think we are covering about 200, 300, 400 maybe people in the product org. Some of those are back-end oriented engineers, so accessibility doesn't apply to them. But yeah, it's a few hundred people.
Yeah, and a key factor I think is knowing what kind of buttons to press for different people. So sometimes it's accessibility is part of doing a professional job. You know, as a developer, you should know this. It needs to be applied. You know, we consider that as part of professionalism. Sometimes it's empathy. Sometimes, you know, it's understanding how different people use things, but different people have sort of different buttons that you can press, essentially. So that's kind of a mix of good and not so good things about our experience on introducing accessibility to organizations. So my next question is, what's the toughest thing been about trying to improve the accessibility of the organization? So kind of from a hard graft point of view, who should I start with? I can't remember who I started with last time now. Random. Tzveta, how about you? What's been the sort of toughest challenge?
So for us, I think definitely retrofitting accessibility into our existing platforms. And I feel like that is probably going to be relatable for a lot of people, just because in an ideal world, you probably want to kind of scrap everything and start again and, you know, consider accessibility from day one. But realistically, when you already have platforms that are, you know, functioning and are working quite well in terms of like a business perspective, you kind of just need to go and start fixing things in what you already have. And for us, that was you know, a web platform, Android and iOS kind of native platforms. And it was very difficult because it was a huge amount of issues that we basically recognized we need to fix. And I think that makes things very challenging in the sense that luckily a lot of these issues were not very complex. So there were things like changing labels and kind of adjusting things here and there because people had already started tackling accessibility, but because it was not kind of a unified effort, a lot of the times it was like, wait, but that we're doing it differently here. So what is the right way to do things? And does that, you know, what does WCAG say and what do we think we should do and things like that. So it was actually like almost, well, considering all platforms, it was close to 1,000 issues altogether. which is a lot. And when you see that number, I think a lot of people get really demotivated, which, you know, makes total sense. I think, I mean, it took us a couple of years to go through everything. But I think what actually happens on the other side, so something to look forward to if you are kind of, you know, going through that process, is that actually people learn a lot. It's almost like an accessibility bootcamp for everyone. So alongside all of like fixing all of these issues, we were running trainings and kind of awareness sessions and, you know, trying to establish what the process for new components is going to be. But actually, people got a lot of hands-on experience with accessibility because they were just fixing so many things as we went along. And now they have a lot of experience with, oh, I know what I'm supposed to do in this situation, because do you remember that issue that we were looking at? And, you know, people have actually spent time like thinking about these things and fixing them. Another positive thing is that everyone that has been part of this process, even partially, even people who maybe joined the company halfway through, they know how difficult it is, and they will do everything to not allow this to ever happen again, which is incredible. Like, I have people now getting in touch with me and just being like, I've done this, I'm using this checklist, you know, this is happening, I got it, just wanted to let you know, because we just don't want to be in that position ever again. So I think that's a very, very valuable lesson that you often get from, I think, difficult things in life in general. But yeah, definitely kind of two sides of the same story for us.
Well, I'm taking from that, make people go through the pain so they don't want to do it again. It's kind of how I feel about PDFs. Sat, what have you found toughest in terms of, you know, work needing to be put in?
I think for me, it's been because I work across the organisation, so I'm always kind of looking at opportunities where, you know, we don't do things well, or we unintentionally put barriers in the way for our customers and our people. But actually, in the digital accessibility space, moving from what I thought was a small digital team, because I knew some people and I could connect with them, and they became champions, and, you know, we worked together. Moving from that to a larger kind of digital team that has numerous directors and, you know, numerous people that I now don't know, is a challenging bit. So it's still working with those champions, but to get the topic of digital accessibility at the forefront of what they're doing, you know, together with the massive transformation program that they're delivering on a day-to-day basis, is challenging. And I think it kind of goes back to a lot of people saying that actually, though, you know, the doers, like Pavel was saying, that, you know, the designers and the developers, you know, to get them to think about accessibility when they know nothing about it is difficult. And really, I've kind of realized that I shouldn't expect that problem needs to be fixed right away, because actually it's more about understanding kind of where the challenges are for those individuals, to understand how they need to fix it. And I'm not an expert either, so it's how can I help, you know, by speaking to the relevant leaders in that team to say, you know, we've got a problem here. Yes, this is the background, and, you know, about accessibility and what it means for our customers and so forth. But it's about kind of getting the buy-in that all of that training, that skill set needs to be focused on as well. And I think this is where I'm at the moment, but I think my group of champions has grown a little bit. So we've now kind of got a bit more expertise as well in the group. And I think more people help champion accessibility, the better. And there's also those silent people that might have raised it in the past, but never really got very far. So it's kind of bringing those people on board and, you know, talking about how we can work together, rather than it being, you know, something that they've raised but never got done, and they're just going back to their day job.
Yeah, and it must be difficult, especially in sort of a large organization. You can run lunch and learns and show and tells and whatever sort of mechanisms you've got, but when you talk to any particular person, you don't know what their level of knowledge is to start with, and you kind of have to try and establish that before you can have a useful conversation with people. Pavel, what's been tough? What's the sort of the hardest graft?
There has been a lot, but I can talk about something that's specific to products like Squarespace. So we are a website builder. So there's a lot of user-generated content there. And if we look at the websites built on Squarespace, a lot, if not most, of the decisions there are made by the customer, not by us. And so the big question is, we have a framework for websites. So if we find some issues there and we want to remediate them, how do we do it? So it is easier with things like focus indicators, things that are not that highly visible to customers, but it's so much harder with things like color contrast or motion. So how do we fix it on an existing site? We cannot just go and update a color, because I mean that would diminish trust between us and the customer. And so how do we make those decisions? How do we strive for a good level of accessibility, but at the same time give our customers some freedom? And it is actually a tricky question, which we haven't fully found an answer to. And I know that a lot of people, both outside and within the organization, they feel that accessibility constraints, they limit creativity. And to some extent, it is true. But whenever I hear something like that, I try to give some examples, like you're building, say, a kitchen, and theoretically you could say, oh, I cannot put a stovetop next to close to the ceiling, you're constraining me. But then I'd be like, yeah, sure, I am trying to constrain you. It would be just extremely silly, it would be unusable if you put that so high up top. So why would you do that on the web? So it's those things.
Yeah, it's one of those things where if people have come up with a design and a solution, and then you start thinking about accessibility, yes, it feels very constraining because your solution didn't include it. Therefore, you notice those differences. Whereas if you include it from the beginning, it's design is all about different constraints and balancing different things. So if you include it from the beginning, it doesn't seem like a constraint because you're building it into the solution. And it's very rare for something you do for accessibility not to have the kind of wider benefit. So if you build it in from the start, people don't notice. No one's going to complain from a regular point of view. But yeah, once you're there and then you start trying to retrofit, that's when people notice.
Yeah, and another thing that I wanted to mention is that there is a lot of internal interest in accessibility and people want to do the right thing. However, when it comes to doing the actual work, the people always ask, but what does accessible mean? Where is the threshold between inaccessible and accessible? Because it is never black and white. And so a challenging thing is setting internal standards that everyone agrees on. It is, of course, easy to say, hey, there's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, go read them and do as they say, but they are fairly abstract. And there's, even on the AA level, there's 50 success criteria on the AA level in WCAG 2.1. And it doesn't really work. So I guess you have to set some standards and talk to people and make sure that everyone's aligned. So that is I would say a challenge as well.
Yes, and I know I might be biased, one of the editors of WCAG, but one thing I do definitely recommend is people kind of make them their own. And I did, if you have a look at the NHS Service Manual, you can see one example of that, which is where we looked through, we did some workshops with the teams, found out what who should be responsible for what, basically. So for every guideline, is that a design thing? Is it a developer thing? Bit of both. But we created guidance that was well above the baseline. So if you consider working a baseline, it's well above it and easier to understand. Because if you're not trying to skate close to the guidelines, it's much easier, at least easier to understand, if not to implement. So, there were something like 13 guidelines that the designers needed to know about, which is a lot less than 50. But that only worked in their context, with their component library, with their ways of doing things. So everyone kind of needs to do that for themselves, unfortunately, because WCAG is supposed to be kind of fairly universally applicable, which means for any individual organization, you want to kind of take your own snapshot, essentially, and create your own version of it. Sorry, that's my personal hobby horse. Who haven't I been to? Beverley. I think it's you left. So the hardest things.
Yeah, I think one of the hardest things for me has been learning to be accessibility as a marathon and not a sprint. Having come from a background of being a developer, it's not about fixing one website. Now, as accessibility lead, it's about fixing the 140 plus websites that the Ministry of Justice owns, and that's a lot of websites. And when you think about it, you're not going to fix that overnight. And I think as an accessibility specialist as well, we all understand the impact of it not being fixed overnight. And I think that does weigh on us a bit sometimes, it does me as an individual. But yeah, when you understand the impact of not doing the fixes, but then you also need to understand that you can't fix them all in one go overnight. So yeah, I think, the challenge for me has been learn how to pace myself and also recognize what I need to not burn out, and to understand what are my own needs. And the more you're aware of your own needs, actually, and the more that you're meeting them, the more you're able to meet the needs of other people. And at its core, isn't that what accessibility is about? Is about people's needs. And one angle that I've grown to learn a lot more about is addressing the needs of teams who are building websites. Because you can go into a team and say, you need to fix this yesterday, but they're not going to do it yesterday. So how can you go in with a more pragmatic approach and come up with a pragmatic solution? So yeah, it's an interesting challenge. Yeah, because there's just so many services at MOJ. A lot of the work is figuring out how many services there are, because there's so many people that there's a lot of people to keep track of.
Yes, and services that pop up that nobody else knows about. Governance is sometimes I do think accessibility is governance at an organizational level, and if an organization doesn't have other governance structures in place before you get to even thinking about accessibility, it's so much harder, because then you're trying to tackle two problems, accessibility and governance, at the same time. Okay, so that's all the hard things we've tried to come across, and I'd be interested if the panelists think of solutions to each other's hardest things. But we'll start off with the other question. So what have you found to be the most effective way? We've talked about this a bit, but there are any sort of effective things you've found to address the problems that have been talked about, your own or other people's? Sat, how about you? What have you found to be the most sort of effective ways of addressing accessibility?
So for me, it's been that stakeholder relationship building and kind of communicating with people. So on one hand, I'm kind of there to support the business, having built relationships with, let's say, the operational teams where customer issues come through. So I'm still there to kind of field some of those responses. But on the kind of the back office side, teams where you've got digital or you've got brand and marketing and so forth, it's well, how do we get them to kind of, one, understand accessibility, and two, kind of knowing how to implement it. So I came up with a framework last year that looked at accessibility standards. So using WCAG as the baseline, but also what else can we do? So let's not just stop there. But that's really something that, as a designer or a non-digital type person, I don't do that as my day job. So it's really difficult for me to say, well, this is how you should do it. I did fall into that trap myself. We need to follow these guidelines, but then obviously people picking them up also didn't know how to implement them. So it's more kind of taking that away and working with product teams, let's say, as an example, and central product teams, if you've kind of got global markets to support, is kind of working with them and educating them and beating on that drum to say, well, actually, my role is really to get involved in everything, or as much as I can, on a roadmap to say, actually, can we see it early? Can we kind of, input our accessibility requirements early? And to be honest, it sometimes a success, but other times we've had to go down the retrofitting route. It's getting a lot better, I must say, but it's kind of working with and continuing that dialogue and talking to people and really having, bringing those ideas to the table, bringing other people in as well is really important, because I'm really keen to kind of bring in that inclusion side of things, so equity sequence. I don't know if anyone's heard of that Tidal Equality's equity sequence practice. If you haven't, I would suggest that you have a look at it, and it's bringing other people's perspectives that are from different backgrounds, that have different characteristics, around that virtual table, or into discussions when you're making key decisions about products or services, and really getting everybody's input, because it shouldn't be one person's or one individual group's decision to make. So yeah, I think that's been the highlight for me, is being able to come up with a framework and being able to talk to from senior managers to the people that are doing the job, and being able to educate people as much as I can. But where I can't, I will say, look, this is where we probably need to go to X organisation or other organisations that do that kind of either customer focus group sessions or surveys or whatever it might be in terms of customer or consumer feedback.
Right. Pavel, how about you?
Yeah, sure.
Most effective things.
It's probably going to be somewhat similar to what Sat just said. I honestly am not sure how to measure effectiveness of certain initiatives, but what we've been trying was we've been trying to win people's hearts. That's one way of dealing with it. We've been giving talks, and we've tried to get as much support from the leadership team as we could. We've tried showing folks how accessibility issue impacted real assistive technology users. That was good. And the other side is, like you said, compliance, governance. So we're now in the beginning of introducing those hard requirements, where if you don't meet a certain guideline, you just don't release your product. So yeah, like a lot of accessibility minded folks suggest, the carrot and the stick. So I'm hopeful that this is gonna work over time, but it is gonna be a long process for us.
Yeah, and I've definitely found, carrot and stick are both needed, but also, you have to sort of support people in their capability in terms of being able to fix accessibility issues before the stick comes in. They do need to know there are consequences further down the road if they don't do anything about it. But certainly start off with the sort of more inspiring and empathic sort of approach before the stick comes out, which unfortunately didn't always work with the public sector regulations coming in, because a lot of people didn't notice it until after it was supposed to have been done already. Okay. Tzveta, how about you? What's the most effective things? And I'm still impressed that you managed to get them to go through that 1,000 issue backlog.
Yeah, I mean, we still have some P3s that we're going through, just for the record. But the, I think 800 odd ones that were high priority, we managed to get them done. So that is definitely a proud moment for me. Even though I didn't do them myself, obviously it was the teams who worked on them. Definitely kind of everything that Sat and Pavel said so far has also been true for us. I think one of the things that I realized kind of being alone in my current role very early on is that I need to empower people to own accessibility in their role through building those relationships and through that training that I was doing. The ultimate goal was to make people feel like they can do it on their own, which they totally can. But a lot of the times it's like, if it's not part of your title or part of your specialism, you feel like, you know, you need to kind of rely on someone else to help you, which is totally fine. And I've always made it very clear for people that I am there to answer questions and to have discussions about things. But I really wanted people to have that confidence that they can tackle a problem without necessarily needing me to kind of weigh on the right way of doing things. And I think that, you know, that again, that happens over time. Like people need to get that experience, which a lot of them got from you know, the audit that we had done and all the issues that we had to fix through, you know, awareness sessions and feeling more comfortable understanding disability, understanding assistive technology use, putting all of these things together, understanding where accessibility sits in the wider kind of context of usability, understanding what we're trying to achieve. And a lot of the times I find now that people are, you know, they take initiative, which is amazing because that's what you ultimately want to do. I think my role, the way I see it, is to basically make myself redundant. Eventually, no one will ask me questions, no one will need me anymore, because they will just have that confidence, and because accessibility will be embedded in such a sustainable way into our processes that we won't need to have that separate conversation about it. It will just be there from day one. What we were saying earlier, basically, about it, you know, if you do it from the discovery phase, you will not need to worry about constraints later on because there are no constraints. Effectively, you've considered it already, it's there. And yeah, I think that has been one of the main things for me specifically, just to be able to handle the amount of issues that needed to be fixed, the amount of, you know, new things that we were working on at the same time, which was just kind of like a lot going on. And yeah, it's been a really kind of interesting experience so far.
And Beverley, how about you?
So for me, I think one of the things that has helped the most with going from viewing it as a sprint to a marathon is thinking about how do we measure progress in that context. You know, with a sprint, you're looking at one website, you fix the issues, the goal is quite clear. But when you're looking at an organization with, you know, 140 plus websites, you have to look at it a bit differently. So how do you capture the data of the progress that you've made? And so for us, we run a consultancy. From that, we've gathered metrics like we know that we worked with 60 plus teams in the past year, looking at the things we can get from the services that we run. But also one thing that I like to do is run accessibility parties, which is where I get people to present what they've done on their own service as a way of us being able to celebrate the work they've done, help promote what they've done to other people, and get more voices into the space. We've done that internally and also across government as well. So that's a nice way of also getting data, but in a much more people-centered way too.
Okay, great. And I'm just about to start on the questions we are getting from the audience. We've got a couple so far. So I'm going to ask one question first and give people a chance to put more questions in if they'd like to. So I mean, when we work with an organization, there's various ingredients to an accessibility program that we tend to recommend. So the big one for me is training, in various levels, in various kind of formats, and ongoing, primarily because, with my personal bugbear of designers and developers on their default education routes don't get any accessibility training. Because that's always the first question I ask when I run training is who's done anything on this before? 10% usually. So apart from keeping me in a job, that's quite depressing. But training's a big one. Setting up, accessibility champions network, so that community aspect, self-help aspects, that's a big one. Some form of testing and measurement, like Beverley was just talking about. And what are is there anything else you would sort of like to add to that, or kind of plus one in terms of what you found most useful from an organizational point of view? I don't know if anyone would like to start. I'll leave that as an open question.
I guess I can start. I would say getting leadership support is the key thing. If you don't like have it initially, or it's ambivalent, you just need to get as much like tangible support as you can. So it has to not just be verbal. Yes, we support accessibility, but they need to prove it with resources for some accessibility programs. So I guess that is one thing that will turn things.
Yeah, it's a good point. And sometimes we try and our little kind of way of trying to do that sometimes is to recommend, here's an internal accessibility policy. Who can we get to sign this off? And you start knocking on doors and going, and that policy includes things like doesn't go live unless it's accessible, and their sort of commitment to a particular standard and that sort of thing. So accessibility policies fairly straightforward, but for me, that's been a way of saying, let's put this in place. And that gives you kind of ammunition to then go and talk to product owners. Because quite often I talk to designers and developers and people actually working on things. And as I think Sat mentioned before, they've generally all been really happy to understand it and to work on things. It's quite often the people in charge of deadlines who are the ones objecting. So that's when, as Pavel was saying, if you get that senior support, it's really helpful to then be talking to product owners, project managers to get them sort of on board with what's going on. Anyone else?
I think one thing that is really helpful in that situation, but also in many others in general, is actually bringing in real life users to do demos and show how they would use your platform, your product, whatever it is that you're working on. That has been game changing for us in terms of, I think I was very lucky that at the point where I joined the organization, there was already buy-in from a lot of kind of the senior leadership. But I think for the people who were still kind of a little bit undecided on where they stand, it was super, super helpful just to bring in an actual user to show them what the experience is, what the constraints are. This is why we're doing it. And it has just been absolutely brilliant. Also, again, bringing these people in, or, doing kind of remote user testing, whatever is obviously works for your situation, but has been super helpful just for general kind of team awareness as well. For getting buy-in from product owners, specifically in our case as well, just for people to see, just to get context, real life context, to see how these people are using a screen reader, how they're using whatever assistive technology that they're using, and to just be explaining, what their experience is, and, where they find things hard and what they would change. And I think there's very little friction in that kind of interaction, in the sense that we're just kind of doing it for general awareness, but people come out of it with ideas on what they can improve and ideas on how they can change their own processes, which I find super, super useful.
Yeah, very good. Beverley, Sat, anything you'd like to mention?
I've got one actually. So with this framework that I created last year, it kind of dawned on me that actually it's all well and good you talking to people about it. It's what you're going to do on top of what they're going to do. So for me, it was looking at governance boards and review boards that happen and getting in really early to do that impact assessment. So hearing from product owners when they're really early in the concept stage of something, and being able to kind of input accessibility, inclusive design at that point, and writing that into the formal process for those governance boards. So that's really kind of, yes, it means now I'm on 3 boards, but it also means that, I feel that, I'm making a difference and educating others to also make that difference with them. So they're learning also, you're transferring that knowledge. It's not something that we want to keep ourselves, is it? We want to impart that knowledge to others and say, well, actually, we're all going to get older. We're all potentially going to be disabled in some way, shape or form as we grow older. So how is it that we can, think about those things, in terms of that, word accessibility, but it's actually, bringing people into the how can we do it together.
Thank you. Beverley, did you want to add anything? Or I can move on to the questions.
Yeah, seconding what Pavel said around getting senior buy-in, that really helped us. I was doing accessibility on my own for 6 months, and then after I put in a proposal for a bigger team, but it really helped that we had the, buy-in from the chief financial officer, who himself is a disability champion at the Ministry of Justice. So yeah, turns out it helps sending random messages in various stand-ups run by senior people. So yeah, that was a bit of a win. That was. Yeah, JSPQ has been really helpful, and also having a strategic approach for how you're going to do it too. So there are lots of authoring tools at MOJ, such as MOJ Forms, which is a form builder tool, and also an accessible WordPress theme, which is used for the arm's length body websites. So we do a lot of partnership with them to make sure that people aren't actually able to build inaccessible things because it's already built into the tool.
Yeah, prevention's better than cure. We've got a couple of questions. So the first one's from Ruth, directed to Pavel, actually. So I'm interested to know more about how Squarespace communicate with their customers about accessibility. I see a lot of small charities and community groups using website builders who value inclusion in their work, but as non-techies, they don't even know accessibility is an issue or what to look for or to do. So I guess the question is, does Squarespace try and sort of encourage people into accessible practices?
So we are, like I said, at the beginning of the journey, and I don't think, so there are some articles about making websites more accessible, and we are considering having more communication when we are ready for it, when we've built a more solid foundation.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing. I did a lot of work with content management systems, and actually before I joined the WCAG sort of group, I was working on the authoring tools accessibility guidelines back in the 2000s. So yes, if you want to discuss that sometime, Pavel, just let me know. I've got plenty of ideas on that. But as Beverley said, if you can, don't even mention it, just use a template where the heading structure is good and the colors are good, and if you build it all in at the kind of template level and remove font pickers and color pickers and things from the WYSIWYG interface, you're halfway there at least. The other question we had was, how do people feel about empathy and simulation type activities? So this is probably a good question because Tzveta mentioned this. Mentioned the alternative to this a minute ago. People often say they've realized only after that only realized only else, but it's so different from what disabled people actually experience. For example, most blind people have some vision and will customize a screen reader experience versus listening to others' experience. So I guess it's, have people tried sort of making an empathy lab or using that type of approach? And would you recommend that compared to usability testing? Beverley, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm really interested in this topic. At the moment, we have some empathy or accessibility bars at the Ministry of Justice. We're having an office space rejig and we're looking to improve them, and they're really interesting. They're based off of the GDS ones, and I think they're useful conversation pieces, but they definitely don't replace talking to disabled people. And one thing that I'm really trying to work on at the Ministry of Justice is how do we enable disabled people to be a bigger part of the accessibility conversation, but in a way that is part of their paid job that they're compensated for. So rather than asking them to take time out of their day job to do some ad hoc testing, how can we actually incorporate that into their day job and also empower them to say no if they don't want to as well. So yeah, how can we get more actual voices of actual disabled people into this space? Because this space is centered on those people, right?
Mm. Did anyone want to add anything to that?
I can.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So I don't know how to compare the effectiveness of bringing in disabled people and seeing them use your product versus having those accessibility labs where anyone can just experience things kind of the way a disabled person would. We are actually right now running a program where every day people at the company try something new, like put your Zoom to 400% in the browser and try navigating an online store, or try navigating this thing with a keyboard alone, or go through a screen reader training. And I know it is eye-opening, but it is, like I said, hard to compare effectiveness because real user tests and the recordings of those tests are also a very effective way, because even if you go through a screen reader training, you will never face the same challenges. You will never see the same barriers as a real assistive technology user would.
Yeah, and yeah, sort of plus one. And for me, they're different things for different purposes. I think it is useful to get product teams, particularly knowing how to use assistive technology, zooming things, and using it as a way of just testing their own interface, essentially. And you can look at things like form fields, and there will be obvious things jumping out if it's not coded correctly if you go through with a screen reader. So it's an efficient way of testing. It is sort of one aspect of it, but it doesn't give you the same answers and the same even knowing how to ask the right questions that bringing people in to realistically use your products will do. So I guess the answer is both, but the using things should be a day-to-day activity, and then the bringing people in should be if you're deciding how features should work, or how to improve things, or even working out what the requirements are in the first place, that's when you really need to talk to people. So I think we are out of time now, but I'd just like to thank everyone on the panel. And I hope everyone who's listening found that very useful, because I always find it useful to compare notes and, with different organizations, different people, different experiences. And then you find, just whatever techniques work for you. So thank you very much, everyone. And I hope to see you again soon.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, everyone. What an awesome session, and an amazing way to wrap up virtually 2022. It's been fantastic to hold this conference to share knowledge and best practice and techniques, innovations, challenges, success stories, and kind of so much more. I mean, it's accessibility is so much more than just making products and services accessible, right? It's being a champion, getting buy-in, educating, being a PR and comms master. It's kind of it's everyone's responsibility. And yeah, we hope you found virtually valuable and you've managed to take away learnings into your day-to-day roles. Here at Nomensa, accessibility is at the core of everything we do. So if you've got any accessibility challenges that you'd like to speak to Alastair and our team about, please do get in touch via hello@nomensa.com. I'd like to thank all of our speakers who've run sessions over the last 3 days, and also a massive thanks to Imi, Claire, Nikki and Catherine from the marketing team here at Nomensa, who without them this wouldn't be possible. And yeah, I'd like to let you know virtually will return once again as a free virtual conference in May 2023 in the week of Global Accessibility Awareness Day once again. Finally, our in-person conferences are back, starting with Collaborate Bristol on the 1st of July at Watershed on Bristol's harbour side. Tickets are on sale. We're running low on standard release tickets now, and we'd love to see you there. So if you're either in the UK or need an excuse to visit, then please do grab a ticket. So yeah, again, thank you. And yeah, we hope to see you there, and if not before. Until next time, thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.